Let your eyes close if you'd like. Take a slow, deep breath. We're about to embark on a journey to one of the most ancient places humans have ever called home. A place where stones hold secrets, where layers of earth preserve the whispers of millennia, where the ground itself becomes a book written in pottery shards and fallen bricks. Tonight, we're traveling to Jericho, not the modern city with its bustling streets and contemporary life, but to the ancient mound known as es-Sultan, where archaeologists have been carefully peeling back the centuries like pages in an impossibly old manuscript. This is a place where the very soil seems to hum with history, where every shovelful of earth might reveal a fragment of someone's daily life from 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 years ago. There's something deeply calming about archaeological sites, isn't there? The way they invite us to slow down, to consider time in its vastness, to recognize that our own hurried lives are just the thinnest layer on top of countless other lives, other stories, other moments of joy and sorrow and mundane existence. At Jericho, this sensation is particularly powerful. The tell rises from the landscape like a patient witness, its soil containing not just one civilization, but dozens stacked atop each other in a vertical library of human experience. We're drawn to places like this for reasons that go beyond simple curiosity. There's something in us that wants to touch the past, to stand where ancient people stood, to hold in our hands the cup from which someone drank 3,000 years ago. It's a kind of time travel, perhaps the only kind we'll ever achieve, and nowhere offers a longer journey through time than Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places on Earth. The biblical story of Jericho is famous, of course. Walls falling at the sound of trumpets, a dramatic conquest, a prostitute named Rahab, whose house on the wall was mysteriously preserved. It's a story that has captured imaginations for millennia, painted on church walls, taught to children, debated by scholars. But what does the ground itself say? What evidence remains in the earth after 3,000 or 4,000 years? And perhaps more importantly, what can archaeology tell us? And what must remain in the realm of interpretation and belief? These are the questions we'll explore tonight, gently, without hurry. We'll walk through the excavations together, meet the archaeologists who dedicated their lives to understanding this place, examine the evidence they uncovered, and consider what it might mean. There are no simple answers here, no neat conclusions. Instead, there's the rich complexity of real history, the honest uncertainty that comes with trying to understand events from the distant past, and the fascinating interplay between physical evidence and ancient narratives. So settle in, let the day's tensions drain away. We have all the time we need to explore this ancient place properly, to appreciate both its certainties and its mysteries. The stones of Jericho have been waiting for thousands of years. They can wait a bit longer while we approach them slowly, thoughtfully, with the reverence they deserve. The oldest walls, Neolithic mysteries, long before any biblical narrative, long before the Canaanites or Israelites, or any people whose names we know from ancient texts. There were people at Jericho, and they built something remarkable, something that still has the power to astonish us today, even after a century of archaeological discoveries around the world. Imagine the year 8000 BCE. Most of human history is already behind us at this point, but it's a history we know almost nothing about, because these people left no writing, built nothing permanent enough to survive 10,000 years. Across most of the world, Humans still lived as their ancestors had for hundreds of thousands of years, following game, gathering wild plants, moving with the seasons. Small bands, temporary camps, a life of mobility. But in a few special places, something new was happening. In the Fertile Crescent, that arc of relatively well-watered land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and down into the Levant, some groups of people were beginning to settle down. They were learning to cultivate plants, to encourage the growth of wheat and barley, to create a reliable food supply that didn't require constant movement. This transition from wandering to settling, from foraging to farming, was perhaps the most significant change in all of human history. It made everything else possible. Cities, writing, civilization itself all flow from that first decision to stay in one place and coax food from the earth. Jericho was one of the very first places where this happened. The reasons are obvious when you visit the site. There's a spring there, es-Sultan, that gushes fresh water year-round, creating a green oasis in an otherwise harsh landscape. Water is life in this part of the world, and a reliable spring is worth more than gold. Around this spring, perhaps as early as 10,000 BCE, people began to linger, first in seasonal camps, then in more permanent structures, then in something we might actually call a settlement. By 8000 BCE, something extraordinary had been built. When British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon discovered it in the 1950s, she could hardly believe what she was seeing. A massive stone wall, over 12 feet high and nearly 6 feet thick at its base, encircling the settlement. This wasn't some simple fence or boundary marker. This was serious construction, requiring coordination, planning, and enormous labor. But even more remarkable was what stood behind the wall. A tower, built of stone, rising 28 feet into the air, with an internal staircase of 22 carefully constructed steps spiraling up through its core. This tower predates the pyramids of Egypt by more than 4,000 years. It predates any other known monumental construction by millennia. When Kenyon found it, she was excavating what she thought would be evidence of the biblical Jericho from the Bronze Age. Instead, she'd uncovered something far, far older. Think about what it took to build such a structure. First, the sheer physical labor, moving and placing stones, each one heavy, each one needing to be positioned just so. Modern estimates suggest it would have taken 100 men, more than 100 days, to complete just the tower, working full-time. For people who were also farming, hunting, making tools, building houses, raising children, this represented an enormous investment of community resources. But more than the labor, consider what it implies about social organization. 100 people don't work together on a single project for months without some kind of leadership, some way of coordinating effort, some means of deciding that yes, we will build this tower, and we will all contribute to its construction. This suggests something beyond a simple village. It suggests hierarchy, specialists, planning, a community sophisticated enough to conceive of and execute a major public works project. The question that has fascinated archaeologists since Kenyon's discovery is simple. Why? Why did these Neolithic people, just learning to farm, just beginning to settle down, build such massive fortifications? The most straightforward explanation would be defense. A wall keeps enemies out. A tower lets you see them coming. But this raises immediate questions. Defense against what? Against whom? The archaeological evidence from this period and region shows no clear signs of organized warfare, no caches of weapons beyond hunting tools, no mass burials suggesting violent conflict, no other fortified sites that would indicate a pattern of hostilities. If these walls were built for defense, the threat they defended against has left no other archaeological trace we've yet discovered. Some researchers have proposed flooding as the answer. The spring at Jericho can be unpredictable, and seasonal floods from the nearby wadis, the normally dry riverbeds that can suddenly surge with water during rains, might have threatened the settlement. According to this interpretation, the wall could have functioned as a massive levee, protecting homes and crops from inundation. This would be practical and wouldn't require us to imagine warfare, for which we have no supporting evidence. But there's a third possibility, one that emerged from research conducted in 2011 by Tel Aviv University archaeologists Ran Barkai and Roy Liran. They use computer modeling to track the movement of the sun and shadows at Jericho during different seasons, based on the topography that existed around 8300 BCE. Their analysis revealed something intriguing. On the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the shadow of nearby Mount Kuruntal would first touch the tower at sunset, then gradually spread across the entire settlement as darkness fell. This astronomical alignment, if intentional, could suggest the tower served social and symbolic purposes. Barkai and Liran proposed that the tower and wall might have been meant to inspire awe, to create a sense of place and permanence, potentially helping to convince people to accept the new, more demanding life that agriculture required. In their view, the tower could have been a way of saying, "This place is special, connected to the cosmos itself, worth committing to." It's worth noting that this astronomical interpretation remains speculative and has faced criticism. Some scholars have questioned whether ancient communities would have feared darkness in the way the theory suggests, or whether the shadow alignment alone provides sufficient evidence for the tower's purpose. The theory is fascinating, but archaeological evidence that would definitively support it, like associated ritual objects or symbolic decorations, simply hasn't been found. We can't know for certain which explanation, if any, is correct. The people who built the tower left no writing, no explanation. They're silent now, separated from us by 10 millennia. But their stones remain. You can still climb the ancient stairs, still touch the walls they built. And whether constructed for defense, flood control, astronomical observation, or purposes we haven't yet imagined, one thing seems clear. These people were capable of sophisticated planning, complex organization, and monumental achievement. They were, in every way that matters, fully human. Just like us, they looked at challenges and devised solutions. Just like us, they organized their communities to accomplish great things. Just like us, they left their mark on the world, hoping perhaps that someone, someday, might remember. The Neolithic walls of Jericho stand as a reminder that human ingenuity, creativity, and ambition are not modern inventions. Our ancestors, even those who lived in what we might think of as primitive conditions, were every bit as clever, every bit as capable of solving problems and creating beauty as we are today. Their tools were simpler, their knowledge of the world different, but their minds were the same minds, working with the same fundamental human capacities. And so the tower stands, or at least its remains stand, in the excavated trenches at es-Sultan. Tourists can visit it now, can see the ancient stonework, can marvel at its age. It's a humbling thing to stand beside a structure built when writing didn't exist, when metals were unknown, when the very concept of civilization was just beginning to emerge. The stones are silent now, but they speak nonetheless, if we know how to listen. Layers upon layers, reading the tell. If you've never visited an archaeological site in the Middle East, the concept of a tell might seem strange at first. Why does the ancient city sit on a mound? Why isn't it just on flat ground like modern cities? The answer is fascinating and speaks to the nature of ancient urban life and the way time itself piles up beneath our feet. A tell is essentially an artificial hill created by successive generations of human occupation. It forms through a simple process, repeated over centuries. People build structures from mud brick, the most common building material in this region. They live in these structures for a generation, maybe two. Eventually, the buildings decay or are destroyed by fire, earthquake, war, or simple neglect. Rather than clearing away all the debris, which would be an enormous task, the next generation simply levels the ruins and builds anew on top of them. Do this for a few centuries, and you have a layer a meter or two thick. Do it for millennia, and you have a mound rising 20, 30, even 40 feet above the surrounding plain. Each layer represents a different period of occupation, a different community, sometimes even a different culture entirely. The tell becomes a vertical timeline, with the oldest material at the bottom and the most recent at the top. At Jericho, this process has been going on for an exceptionally long time. The mound of es-Sultan contains the remains of settlements stretching back to the Neolithic period, through the Bronze Age, into the Iron Age, and beyond. It's like a layer cake of human history, each stratum representing a different slice of time. For archaeologists, this layering is both a blessing and a challenge. It's a blessing because it preserves such a long sequence of human occupation, allowing researchers to track changes over time, to see how pottery styles evolved, how building techniques improved, how trade networks expanded. It's a challenge because later, occupations often disturb earlier ones. When Iron Age residents dug foundations for their buildings, they sometimes cut through Bronze Age layers. When medieval farmers ploughed the site, their tools churned the soil, mixing materials from different periods. This is why archaeological excavation requires such painstaking care. It's not enough to simply dig and collect artifacts. Archaeologists must carefully record exactly where each object is found, in which layer, in relation to which architectural features. They must distinguish between materials that were deposited when the layer was originally occupied, and materials that were intrusive, that fell or were dug into the layer from above or below. The method for doing this was revolutionized in the early 20th century. Before that, archaeology was often little better than treasure hunting. Excavators would dig through sites looking for impressive objects to send to museums, paying little attention to the context in which items were found. The result was that valuable information was lost forever, and it became nearly impossible to understand the chronology of a site, or to correlate finds from different locations. This began to change with archaeologists like Sir Flinders Petrie in Egypt, and later Sir Mortimer Wheeler in England and India. They developed systematic methods for excavation, emphasizing careful recording, stratigraphic analysis, and the importance of even mundane finds like pottery sherds. Wheeler's system, which involved digging in carefully measured squares separated by bulks or standing walls of earth that preserved the site's stratigraphy, became particularly influential. It was this Wheeler method that Kathleen Kenyon would bring to Jericho in the 1950s, applying it with unprecedented rigor and creating what became known as the Wheeler-Kenyon method. But we'll get to her work in more detail shortly. For now, let's simply appreciate what this layering means for understanding Jericho. At the very bottom, in the oldest layers, we find the Neolithic settlement we've already discussed. These layers contain stone tools, plastered floors, and the foundations of circular houses. There's no pottery here, because pottery hadn't been invented yet. These are the pre-pottery Neolithic layers, designated PPNA and PPNB by archaeologists who love their acronyms. Moving up through time, we eventually reach layers where pottery begins to appear. Pottery is incredibly important for archaeology because styles changed relatively quickly, and each period had characteristic forms and decorations. A trained archaeologist can often date a layer to within a century or two, just by examining the pottery sherds found in it. The Bronze Age layers at Jericho are particularly thick and complex, representing centuries of occupation during which the site was a prosperous city. These are the layers that contain the famous walls, the ones that might relate to the biblical narrative. But they also contain dozens of other layers, representing periods when the walls were rebuilt, when houses were constructed and destroyed, when life went on in all its ordinary complexity. One of the challenges at Jericho is that not all of these layers are equally well preserved. The top of the tell has been eroded by wind and rain over the centuries. Later occupations have sometimes completely removed earlier ones. Agricultural activity in later periods churned up the soil. All of this means that the archaeological record is incomplete, like a book with pages torn out. We can read what remains, but we have to acknowledge that parts of the story are missing. This incompleteness is particularly acute for the Late Bronze Age, the period that would correspond to the biblical narrative about Joshua and the Israelite conquest. Some excavators have found very little Late Bronze material and concluded that the site was largely abandoned during this period. Others have found enough evidence to suggest continued occupation, though perhaps on a smaller scale than during the Middle Bronze Age. Still others argue that Late Bronze layers were simply removed by later activity, and their absence doesn't mean the site was unoccupied. You can see how complex this gets. It's not like reading a history book, where events are neatly laid out in chronological order. It's more like being a detective, trying to reconstruct what happened based on fragmentary clues, knowing that crucial evidence might be missing, that witnesses might be unreliable, that different pieces of evidence might seem to point in different directions. Add to this the fact that different excavators have worked at the site using different methods, digging in different areas, publishing their results with different levels of detail, and sometimes reaching contradictory conclusions. The early excavators in the first decade of the 20th century thought they'd found the walls from the biblical narrative. Later excavators revised this conclusion. Still later, researchers revised the revisions. Even today, experts disagree about basic facts like when the major Bronze Age city was destroyed and whether there was significant occupation during the Late Bronze Age. This might seem frustrating. Don't. These archaeologists know what they're doing. Can't they just tell us what happened? But this uncertainty, this ongoing debate, is actually how archaeology works. It's not a matter of simply uncovering facts. It's a matter of interpreting fragmentary evidence, evidence that often admits of multiple reasonable interpretations. As new techniques are developed, as new excavations are conducted. As researchers examine previously excavated material with fresh eyes, our understanding evolves. The tell itself doesn't change. The layers are what they are. The pottery sherds and building foundations and charred grain are what they are. But our reading of them changes as we learn more, as we develop better methods, as we ask new questions. In this sense, the tell is like a text that can be read and reread, each reading potentially yielding new insights. This is what makes archaeology endlessly fascinating. It's not a dead discipline, cataloguing fixed facts. It's a living conversation with the past, a conversation that changes as we do, as our methods improve, as our questions become more sophisticated. The stones of Jericho have been telling their stories for millennia. We are still learning how to listen. Enter the archaeologists. Early excavations. The modern archaeological investigation of Jericho began in 1868, a time when the field of archaeology itself was still young, still developing the methods and principles that would guide it in the 20th century. The first person to excavate at the site was Charles Warren, working on behalf of the Palestine Exploration Fund, a British organization dedicated to the systematic exploration of the Holy Land. Warren was primarily an engineer and surveyor, rather than an archaeologist in the modern sense. His excavations at Jericho were limited, essentially test trenches to see what might be there. He correctly identified the mound of es-Sultan as the site of ancient Jericho, based on its proximity to the copious spring that Edward Robinson had earlier identified as the probable spring of Elisha mentioned in the Bible. But Warren didn't have the resources for a major excavation. He noted the presence of substantial ruins and moved on, his trenches providing a first glimpse into the depths of the tell, but not revealing its full secrets. The first systematic excavation came nearly 40 years later, between 1907 and 1911, when German archaeologists Ernst Sellin and Karl Watzinger conducted seasonal digs at the site. These excavations were far more extensive, uncovering substantial remains of ancient walls and towers. Sellin and Watzinger initially believed they had found the walls mentioned in the Book of Joshua, the walls that famously fell when the Israelites marched around the city for 7 days. Their excitement is understandable. Here were massive fortifications that had clearly been destroyed. The biblical narrative was specific and dramatic. Finding walls at ancient Jericho that had fallen seemed to confirm the story. They announced their discovery with considerable fanfare, and it was widely publicized as archaeological confirmation of the biblical account. But there was a problem. As Sellin and Watzinger continued their work and compared their finds with discoveries being made at other sites in the region, they began to realize that their dating was wrong. The walls they had found, while certainly impressive and certainly destroyed, appeared to be much older than the period when Joshua would have lived according to biblical chronology. In 1926, Watzinger published a revision of their earlier conclusions. He now attributed what they called the Cyclopean Wall, a massive stone fortification, to the Middle Bronze Age, not to the Late Bronze Age, when Joshua would have conquered the city. The double mud brick wall they had initially identified as Canaanite fortifications from Joshua's time was actually even older, dating to the early Bronze Age. This was an early example of a pattern that would repeat throughout Jericho's excavation history. Initial enthusiasm about finding evidence for the biblical narrative, followed by more careful analysis, suggesting the chronology didn't match. It's a pattern that reflects both the power of the biblical story to shape expectations and the rigorous demands of archaeological method, which requires that evidence be interpreted on its own terms, rather than fit into preconceived narratives. The next major excavation came in the 1930s, led by British archaeologist John Garstang. Garstang dug at Jericho for 6 seasons, from 1930 to 1936, and his work was more systematic and better documented than the earlier German excavations. He focused on a residential area west of the spring, excavating houses, streets, and the fortification walls. Garstang's conclusions reignited the debate about the biblical narrative. Unlike Sellin and Watzinger in their revised assessment, Garstang believed he had found evidence for destruction in the Late Bronze Age, around 1400 BCE. This matched the biblical chronology if you accepted certain assumptions about dates. He found evidence of massive burning, collapsed walls, and what appeared to be a sudden, violent end to the city. His findings created considerable excitement among those who saw them as confirmation of the biblical account. Here was a respected archaeologist, using modern methods, concluding that yes, Jericho had been destroyed at approximately the right time, in approximately the manner described in Joshua. Articles were written, lectures given, and Garstang's work was widely cited as evidence that archaeology supported the historicity of the conquest narrative. But Garstang's work had its critics even at the time. His excavation methods, while good for the 1930s, were not as rigorous as they would become in later decades. His pottery analysis was less detailed than it might have been, and his dating relied heavily on certain assumptions that not all archaeologists accepted. More importantly, Garstang himself wasn't entirely confident in his conclusions. He knew there were ambiguities in the evidence, places where the data could be interpreted differently. Toward the end of his life, troubled by these uncertainties, he did something remarkable. He asked Kathleen Kenyon, a younger British archaeologist who was gaining a reputation for exceptionally careful excavation methods, to review his findings. This invitation would lead to the next major phase of excavation at Jericho, one that would revolutionize our understanding of the site, but also complicate the picture considerably. Before we turn to Kenyon's work, though, it's worth pausing to appreciate what these early excavators accomplished despite the limitations of their time. Warren, Sellin, Watzinger, and Garstang were pioneers. They worked before radiocarbon dating, before many of the scientific techniques that modern archaeologists take for granted. They had to develop their chronologies based primarily on pottery analysis and comparisons with other sites, a method that required enormous knowledge and experience, but that also left room for error. They excavated in difficult conditions, often in extreme heat, with local workers who needed training in the careful techniques required for proper excavation. They dealt with limited budgets, political complications, and the logistical challenges of working far from home in a region that lacked modern infrastructure. And they were driven by a genuine passion to understand the past. Yes, many of them hoped to find evidence relating to the biblical narrative. They were, after all, products of their time, and the Bible was a text they knew intimately. But they were also scientists, or trying to be, developing and refining methods for extracting reliable information from the ground. Their work laid the foundation for everything that came after. They established the basic chronology of the site, identified the major periods of occupation, uncovered the first evidence of the remarkable Neolithic settlement. Their publications, their photographs, their records, imperfect as they might be by modern standards, preserved information that would otherwise have been lost. Archaeology is cumulative, Each generation builds on the work of previous generations, refining methods, correcting errors, asking new questions. The early excavators at Jericho were the first to read this particular text of earth and stone. That they didn't always read it perfectly is hardly surprising. What's remarkable is how much they did manage to learn, working with the tools and knowledge available to them. As we drift towards sleep, let's appreciate these pioneering archaeologists. Picture them under the hot sun of the Jordan Valley, carefully brushing away soil, mapping foundations, recording finds. They were reaching across millennia, trying to touch the lives of people long dead, trying to understand how those ancient inhabitants lived, worked, built, and died. It's noble work, this attempt to recover and honor the past. And at Jericho, their efforts revealed layer after layer of human story, each one adding depth and complexity to our understanding of our shared human journey. Kathleen Kenyon, Revolution in Technique. Born in London in 1906, Kathleen Mary Kenyon grew up in a household steeped in scholarship and history. Her father, Sir Frederick Kenyon, was a noted biblical scholar who would eventually become director of the British Museum. Their home was actually attached to the museum, giving young Kathleen unprecedented access to artifacts and knowledge from around the world. She was an exceptional student, excelling particularly in history, and eventually studied at Somerville College, Oxford. While at Oxford, she became the first female president of the Oxford University Archaeological Society, a position that reflected her growing passion for the field. She also played hockey at a high level, earning a blue, Oxford's highest athletic honour. This combination of intellectual rigour and physical toughness would serve her well in the demanding work of field archaeology. Kenyon's entry into archaeology came through a series of influential excavations in the 1920s and 1930s. In 1928, she joined the excavations at Great Zimbabwe, working under Gertrude Caton Thompson. This dig was important for several reasons, not least because it demonstrated through careful stratigraphic excavation that the famous ruins were medieval and indigenous, not ancient and foreign, as some had claimed for ideological reasons. For Kenyon, it was a formative lesson in how rigorous archaeological method could resolve controversial questions. The following year, 1929, she joined Mortimer Wheeler's excavations at Verulamium, a Roman site near St. Albans in England. It was here that she learned the method that would become her hallmark, the Wheeler system of excavation. This involved digging in carefully measured squares, typically 5 meters by 5 meters, separated by bulks or standing walls of earth. These bulks preserved the site's stratigraphy, allowing archaeologists to see how different layers related to each other, to read the site's history in its vertical profile. Wheeler's method was revolutionary for its time because it prioritized careful observation and recording over rapid digging. The goal wasn't to uncover impressive finds as quickly as possible, but to understand the site's history in all its complexity. Every layer mattered. Every find had to be precisely located. Every relationship between features had to be carefully documented. Kenyon took this method and refined it further, adapting it specifically for the mud brick archaeology of the Middle East, where sites like Jericho presented different challenges than the stone structures of Roman Britain. She became known for her meticulous approach, her insistence on proper training for workers, her detailed record keeping, and her ability to read complex stratigraphy. By 1951, she was ready for Jericho. The British School of Archaeology in Jerusalem invited her to undertake new excavations at the site, partly in response to Garstang's request that someone review his findings with modern methods. Kenyon began work in 1952 and would continue for 6 seasons through 1958. Her excavations at Jericho were conducted with unprecedented care and precision. She employed the Wheeler-Kenyon method rigorously, digging in measured squares, maintaining bulks, recording every detail. She trained local workers in proper excavation techniques. She took thousands of photographs, made detailed drawings, kept meticulous notes. The scope of her work was impressive. She excavated on the western side of the Tell, cutting deep trenches that revealed the full depth of occupation from Neolithic to Iron Age. She also worked in the area where Garstang had dug, re-examining and clarifying his findings, and she explored the extensive cemetery areas around the Tell, excavating hundreds of tombs that provided crucial information about the beliefs, practices, and chronology of Jericho's ancient inhabitants. Kenyon's discoveries were extraordinary. She was the first to recognize just how old the Neolithic settlement was. The tower and wall that she uncovered in Trench 1 stunned the archaeological world. At the time, nothing else like them was known. They pushed back the date of monumental architecture by millennia and suggested a far more sophisticated level of Neolithic social organization than anyone had imagined possible. She also clarified the stratigraphy of the Bronze Age city, identifying multiple phases of construction, destruction, and rebuilding. She found the massive fortification system with its revetment wall, earthen rampart, and mud brick city wall. She uncovered houses, palaces, tombs, and artifacts spanning centuries of occupation. But it was her conclusions about the dating of the final Bronze Age destruction that would prove most controversial. Based on her analysis, particularly of the pottery, Kenyon concluded that the major fortified city at Jericho was destroyed around 1550 BCE, at the end of the Middle Bronze Age, not around 1400 BCE in the Late Bronze Age, as Garstang had suggested. This was significant because if Kenyon was correct, there would have been no walled city at Jericho for Joshua to conquer. According to Kenyon, the Late Bronze Age occupation was minimal, consisting perhaps of a small settlement, but nothing matching the biblical description of a major fortified city. Her conclusion was based primarily on the absence of certain types of imported pottery from Cyprus, known as Cypriot bichrome ware, that was common at other sites in the region during the Late Bronze One period. Since she didn't find this distinctive pottery in her excavations, she reasoned that the site must have been largely abandoned during that period. The major destruction, with its massive burn layer and collapsed walls, must therefore have occurred earlier, in the Middle Bronze Age. Kenyon's scholarly reputation and her rigorous methods gave her conclusions enormous weight. Her work was hailed as a model of proper archaeological technique. Many scholars accepted her dating and concluded that the biblical narrative of Joshua conquering a fortified Jericho could not be historically accurate. This had wide-ranging implications for biblical archaeology and for the relationship between archaeological findings and biblical texts. If archaeology showed that Jericho fell 150 years before Joshua could have arrived, what did that mean for the historical reliability of the conquest narratives? Some saw it as proof that these stories were later legends rather than historical accounts. Others argued that the absence of archaeological evidence didn't necessarily mean the events didn't happen, just that we hadn't found or correctly interpreted the evidence. The debate that Kenyon's work sparked continues to this day, though it has become more nuanced and complex as more evidence has come to light. But before we examine the critiques and reassessments of her work, it's important to appreciate Kenyon's genuine scholarly achievement. She revolutionized the excavation of Jericho. Her methods set a new standard for the region. Her discoveries, particularly of the Neolithic settlement, were genuinely groundbreaking. Her detailed publications, even though the final reports weren't completed until after her death, provided a wealth of data that subsequent researchers could examine and reinterpret. Kenyon was elected a Fellow of the British Academy, received a DBE making her Dame Kathleen Kenyon, and was appointed Principal of St Hugh's College, Oxford, a position she held from 1962 to 1973. In Jordan, she was known affectionately as the Great Sit Kathleen, a term of respect that reflected the impact she'd made on the field and on the people who worked with her. She died in 1978, having dedicated her life to understanding the ancient world through meticulous, careful archaeology. Her legacy at Jericho is complex, as we'll see, but her contribution to the field of archaeology itself is unquestionable. She showed that women could lead major excavations, that rigorous method could resolve contentious questions, and that patience and precision were worth more than rapid results and spectacular claims. As we think about Kenyon working in those deep trenches at Jericho, carefully brushing away soil, studying pottery sherds, drawing stratigraphy, we can imagine her at the intersection of past and present. She was reaching back through millennia, trying to understand people who left no writing, trying to reconstruct their lives from the things they left behind. And she was doing it with a commitment to truth, to following the evidence wherever it led, even when that evidence challenged cherished beliefs. That commitment to truth, to rigorous method, to careful observation is what makes good archaeology possible. It's what allows us to learn from the past, rather than simply projecting our assumptions onto it. Kenyon embodied that commitment, and for that, she deserves our respect and gratitude. The Bronze Age question. The Bronze Age at Jericho spans a long period, from roughly 3300 BCE to 1200 BCE, over 2,000 years, during which metals were first introduced, then became common, then essential to daily life and warfare. This entire span is divided by archaeologists into the Early Bronze Age, the Middle Bronze Age, and the Late Bronze Age, each with its own subdivisions. For our purposes, the most important distinction is between the Middle Bronze Age, which ended around 1550 BCE, and the Late Bronze Age, which lasted from about 1550 to 1200 BCE. This distinction matters because the biblical narrative about Joshua, if it has a historical core, would most likely date to somewhere in the Late Bronze Age, probably between 1400 and 1200 BCE, based on various biblical chronologies. The question that has consumed biblical archaeologists for over a century is simple. What do we find in the ground at Jericho from this crucial period? Is there evidence of a fortified city being destroyed around the right time? And if so, what can that evidence tell us about what actually happened? Let's start with what's not in dispute. During the Middle Bronze Age, specifically in what archaeologists call Middle Bronze towns, roughly 1750 to 1550 BCE, Jericho was a prosperous, heavily fortified city. The fortifications were impressive by any standard, consisting of multiple defensive elements working together. At the base was a massive stone revetment wall sloping upward from the plain. This wall was designed to support an enormous earthen rampart, a sloping embankment of compacted earth that rose at a steep angle. On top of this rampart sat the city wall proper, built of mud brick. The total height of this defensive system, from the base of the stone revetment to the top of the mud brick wall, would have been formidable, perhaps 30 feet or more. This wasn't simple defensive architecture. It represented sophisticated military engineering. The sloping rampart made it nearly impossible to bring siege equipment close to the walls or to undermine them. The height made scaling difficult. The combination of stone base, earth rampart, and mud brick wall created a defense in depth that could withstand sustained attack. Inside these walls, the city thrived. Houses were built close together, their walls sharing common foundations, creating a dense urban environment. Narrow streets wound between the structures. Storage jars held grain, oil, and wine. Ovens baked bread. Workshops produced pottery, textiles, and tools. This was a functioning city with all the complexity that implies: commerce, social hierarchy, specialized crafts, religious practices, political organization. Then this city was destroyed. The evidence for destruction is clear and dramatic. Thick layers of ash and burned debris mark the end of the Middle Bronze Age city. Walls collapsed. Buildings burned. Life stopped suddenly. When archaeologists excavate these destruction layers, they find pottery vessels crushed under fallen walls, grain still in storage jars. Evidence of a catastrophe that came quickly enough that people didn't have time to retrieve their possessions. This is the destruction that Garstang initially thought corresponded to the Joshua narrative. It's also the destruction that Kenyon studied and dated to around 1550 BCE. Too early for Joshua. But here's where things get interesting and complicated. Kenyon's conclusion that the site was largely abandoned during the late Bronze Age was based primarily on her not finding certain types of pottery. The logic goes like this. During the 14th century BCE, a distinctive type of imported pottery from Cyprus, called Cypriot, Bichrome ware, was widely traded in the Levant. It shows up at archaeological sites throughout the region. If Jericho had been occupied during this period, we should find this pottery. Kenyon didn't find it, therefore Jericho must not have been significantly occupied. This is solid archaeological reasoning as far as it goes, but it has several potential weaknesses. First, absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. Just because Kenyon didn't find Cypriot pottery doesn't definitively prove it was never there. Perhaps it existed in areas she didn't excavate. Perhaps it was in layers that had been eroded away. Perhaps Jericho's late Bronze inhabitants, if they existed, simply didn't import much Cypriot pottery for economic or cultural reasons. Second, Kenyon's excavations, while extensive, didn't cover the entire tell. Jericho is a large site, and even 6 seasons of digging can't expose everything. Later, excavators working in different areas have sometimes found evidence that Kenyon missed. Third, the chronology of Cypriot pottery itself has been refined since Kenyon's day. Some types she thought were exclusively 14th century are now known to have appeared earlier or lasted later than she believed. This affects the dating arguments that rely on pottery typology. These concerns don't mean Kenyon was wrong, but they do suggest that her conclusions might not be as definitive as they initially seemed. And indeed, since her excavations, other researchers have challenged her interpretations, most notably an American archaeologist named Bryant Wood. In the 1990s, Wood published a detailed re-examination of the evidence from Jericho, including Kenyon's own finds, which are stored in various museums and institutions. His conclusion was startling. Kenyon had been wrong about the dating. The major destruction occurred not in 1550 BCE, but around 1400 BCE, exactly when it needed to be for the biblical narrative. Wood based his argument on several lines of evidence. First, he noted that Kenyon had found some late bronze pottery at the site, even though she'd minimized its significance. Second, he pointed to Egyptian scarabs, small amulets that can be dated based on their style and the names of pharaohs inscribed on them. The scarabs from Jericho's destruction layers, Wood argued, dated to the 15th century BCE, not the 16th. Third, he cited radiocarbon dates from grain found in the destruction layers that suggested dates around 1400 BCE. Wood's work generated considerable excitement among those who saw it as vindicating the historical reliability of the Joshua narrative. Finally, archaeology seemed to be confirming the Bible again, but many mainstream archaeologists were skeptical of Wood's arguments, finding them selective in their use of evidence and too eager to reach a predetermined conclusion. The debate between the Kenyon position and the Wood position illustrates something important about archaeology. The same evidence can often be interpreted in different ways, depending on what assumptions you bring to it, what you emphasize, and how you deal with ambiguities. Neither position is simply making things up. Both are trying to make sense of real evidence, but they reach different conclusions. Since the 1990s, new excavations have been conducted at Jericho by an Italian-Palestinian team led by Lorenzo Nigro and Hamdan Taha. Their work, which began in 1997 and continues to the present, has added new layers of complexity to our understanding. Nigro's team has found evidence suggesting that the late bronze occupation at Jericho was more substantial than Kenyon thought, though still not as extensive as the Middle Bronze city. They've identified buildings, pottery, and other materials dating to the late Bronze period, around 1500 to 1400 BCE. This suggests some level of continued occupation after the major Middle Bronze destruction, though there's debate about whether it was a significant urban center or just a small settlement. Importantly, Nigro dates the final destruction of the Bronze Age city to around 1350 BCE, in the middle of the Late Bronze Age. This is later than Kenyon's date, but earlier than Wood's. It's also, according to most biblical chronologies, about 50 to 100 years too late for Joshua. Where does this leave us? The honest answer is uncertain. We know there was a major fortified city at Jericho during the Middle Bronze Age. We know it was destroyed catastrophically. We know there was less substantial occupation during the Late Bronze Age. Beyond that, the details remain contested. Was there a walled city at Jericho when Joshua would have arrived? Kenyon said no. Wood says yes. Nigro says maybe, but probably not as extensive as the biblical narrative suggests. Who's right? Scholars disagree, and new evidence might yet shift the consensus again. This uncertainty can be frustrating, but it's also an opportunity for intellectual humility. The past doesn't give up its secrets easily. 3,000 years is a long time, and the evidence that survives is fragmentary. We do the best we can with what we have, knowing that our conclusions are provisional, subject to revision as new data emerges, or new techniques allow us to see old evidence in new ways. What we can say with confidence is that Jericho was an important place for a very long time. Whether or not the specific events described in Joshua happened exactly as written, the site's long history of fortification, destruction, and rebuilding speaks to its strategic importance. Cities don't build such massive defenses unless they face real threats. The defensive walls of Jericho, in whatever period they were built and destroyed, tell us about a violent world where security required constant vigilance an enormous investment in fortifications. As we contemplate these ancient walls, we might think about the people who built them, who maintained them, who trusted them to keep danger at bay. We might think about the fear that drove such massive building projects, about the enemies these walls were meant to keep out, about the moments when walls proved insufficient and cities fell anyway. Walls, after all, are about more than just stones and bricks. They're about the human need for security, for shelter, for protection from a dangerous world. The walls of Jericho, whether they fell to Israelite trumpets or to Canaanite sieges, or simply to time and neglect, represent humanity's endless attempt to create safety in an uncertain world. That's a story we can all relate to, regardless of our beliefs about the biblical narrative. The biblical narrative. Let's turn now to the story itself, the account in the book of Joshua that has shaped how we think about Jericho for thousands of years. It's a story most people know, at least in outline. The Israelites, having escaped from Egypt and wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, are finally ready to enter the promised land. Their first major obstacle is Jericho, a fortified city that blocks their path. God gives Joshua a strange battle plan. The Israelites are to march around the city once a day for 6 days, with priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant and blowing ram's horns. On the 7th day, they're to march around 7 times. And when the priests give a long blast on the horns, all the people are to shout. When they do this, the walls will collapse, and they can charge straight into the city. Joshua follows these instructions exactly. On the 7th day, after the 7th circuit, the priests blow their horns, the people shout, and the walls fall down flat. The Israelites rush in and destroy the city, killing all the inhabitants, except for Rahab, the prostitute, and her family, who had hidden Israelite spies earlier and were promised safety in return. The story also mentions that Rahab's house was on the city wall, and it survived while the rest of the walls collapsed. After the destruction, Joshua pronounces a curse on anyone who rebuilds Jericho, declaring that whoever does so will lose their firstborn son when they lay the foundations and their youngest son when they set up the gates. This is the narrative. What aspects of it can archaeology address, and what aspects lie beyond archaeological verification? Let's start with what archaeology can't tell us. It can't prove or disprove divine intervention. If you believe God caused the walls to fall, no amount of evidence showing natural collapse will change your mind because you believe God works through natural means. If you don't believe in divine intervention, no archaeological evidence will convince you otherwise. This is a matter of faith, not empirical evidence, and that's perfectly appropriate. Faith and science operate in different domains. Similarly, archaeology can't verify specific details, like the number of circuits the Israelites made, or whether priests blew ram's horns. These are actions that leave no physical trace. Even if we could prove that Jericho's walls fell at exactly the right time, we still couldn't prove from archaeology alone that they fell because of marching and trumpet blowing, rather than earthquake, siege, or other causes. What archaeology can address are the more mundane claims. Was there a fortified city at Jericho at the relevant time? Were its walls destroyed? Is there evidence of burning and violent destruction? Does the timeline make sense? Is there evidence of Israelite occupation after the destruction? We've already discussed the debates about dating. Setting those aside for the moment, let's look at some specific claims in the narrative that have archaeological implications. First, the walls falling down flat. This is actually a surprisingly specific detail. Most city walls, when destroyed by siege or age, don't fall straight down. They tend to fall inward, pulled by gravity into the city. But the biblical text says the walls fell down flat, and it says the Israelites went up into the city, suggesting the collapsed walls formed a ramp. Garstang reported finding exactly this. He described the city walls as having fallen outward, down the slope of the tell, creating a ramp of collapsed bricks that would have allowed attackers to climb directly into the city. This seemed to match the biblical account perfectly and was cited as confirmation of the story's accuracy. However, Kenyon disputed this interpretation. She argued that what Garstang had identified as outward fallen walls was actually the eroded remains of the earthen rampart, not the walls themselves. The actual city wall, she said, had been largely destroyed by erosion and later building, making it impossible to determine how it had fallen. More recent excavators have found that the situation is complex. Some sections of the walls do appear to have collapsed outward, possibly due to earthquake, but other sections collapsed inward or were destroyed more gradually. The picture is mixed, not uniform, which makes simple confirmation or disconfirmation of the biblical account difficult. Second, there's the claim about burning. The biblical narrative is clear that the city was burned. Joshua chapter 6 verse 24 states, "Then they burned the whole city and everything in it." Does the archaeology show burning? Yes, emphatically. Every excavator at Jericho has found extensive evidence of burning in the Bronze Age destruction layers. Thick deposits of ash, charred wood, reddened brick from intense heat, grain that was carbonized by fire. The city didn't just burn, it burned intensely and thoroughly. This is significant because it indicates violent destruction rather than simple abandonment. Cities that are peacefully abandoned don't burn. The fire evidence strongly suggests conquest or some other catastrophic event. Third, there's the curious detail about stored grain. In Joshua 6:17, the Israelites are commanded to destroy everything in Jericho except the silver, gold, and other metals, which are to go into the Lord's treasury. This implies that they didn't loot the city for food or other useful goods. Archaeologists at Jericho have found something unusual. Large quantities of grain still in storage jars. In a typical siege, attackers would have taken or destroyed the grain. Its presence suggests either that the city fell quickly before supplies were depleted, or that the conquerors chose not to take it, perhaps for religious reasons as the biblical account suggests. Wood made much of this grain evidence, arguing that it confirmed the biblical account's detail about not plundering the city. Critics counter that the grain could have other explanations. Perhaps the destruction happened at harvest time when stores were full. Perhaps the grain belonged to people who fled, and there was no one to cart it away. The presence of grain is intriguing, but not definitive. Fourth, there's Rahab's house on the wall. The biblical narrative states that Rahab lived in a house built into the city wall, and that when the spies visited her, they let themselves down by a rope through her window, which would have been on the outer side of the wall. Houses built into fortification walls are well attested in ancient Near Eastern archaeology. It was common practice, especially for poorer residents who couldn't afford property in the city centre. These houses would use the massive city wall as one wall of the house, with other walls built perpendicular to it. Garstang reported finding a section of the wall that remained standing while the walls on either side had collapsed. He suggested this might have been the location of Rahab's house. Again, this seemed like remarkable confirmation. But again, Kenyon was skeptical. She argued that Garstang's standing wall section was from a different period than the destruction he was associating with Joshua. The chronology didn't match. More recent work by the Italian-Palestinian team has identified sections of the Bronze Age walls that did remain partially standing, built against and incorporating the earlier fortification system. Could one of these have been Rahab's house? Possibly, but there's no way to identify a specific house from 3,000 years ago unless it has distinctive features or inscriptions, which this one doesn't. Finally, there's the curse Joshua pronounces on anyone who rebuilds the city. This is actually testable archaeologically. If the city was indeed left in ruins and not rebuilt, we should see a gap in occupation. If it was rebuilt quickly, we shouldn't. The evidence suggests a complex pattern. There does appear to have been reduced occupation at Jericho after the major Bronze Age destruction, though exactly how reduced and for how long is debated. The site was certainly reoccupied eventually, but perhaps not as a major fortified city for some time. Interestingly, 1 Kings 1634 records that in the 9th century BCE, during the reign of King Ahab, a man named Heel from Bethel rebuilt Jericho, laying its foundation at the cost of Abiram, his firstborn, and setting up its gates at the cost of his youngest son, Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spoke by Joshua, the son of Nun. This suggests the biblical tradition remembered a long period when Jericho was not a major city, followed by a rebuilding that indeed cost the builder his sons, though whether literally or figuratively is unclear. So what can we conclude about the relationship between the biblical narrative and the archaeological evidence? The most honest answer is that the evidence is consistent with some aspects of the story, but can't prove the story happened as written. There definitely was a fortified city at Jericho that was violently destroyed. The destruction included extensive burning. There was grain left in storage. Some wall sections remained standing, while others collapsed. The site may have been less intensively occupied for a period after this destruction. All of these facts are consistent with the biblical account, but they're also consistent with other scenarios. A city destroyed by earthquake, fire, and subsequent looting by various groups would look similar. A city conquered in a more conventional military campaign would show much the same evidence. The crucial question of timing remains unresolved. If the destruction occurred in 1550 BCE as Kenyon argued, it's too early for Joshua. If it occurred in 1400 BCE as Wood argued, the timing could work. If it occurred in 1350 BCE as Nigro suggests, it's a bit late, but not impossibly so. Different people will weigh this evidence differently based on their prior commitments. Those who approach the biblical text with trust will tend to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support the narrative. Those who approach it with skepticism will do the opposite, and those trying to remain neutral will probably conclude that the evidence is intriguing but inconclusive. What's important is being honest about what archaeology can and can't do. It can tell us about material culture, about when cities were built and destroyed, about how people lived and what they ate and what tools they used. It can sometimes tell us about major historical events if those events left clear physical evidence. But it can't usually tell us about motives, beliefs, or divine intervention. It can't prove that a specific group of people conquered a city unless they left distinctive artifacts or inscriptions, and it often can't date events precisely enough to resolve questions that depend on differences of a few decades. The story of Joshua and Jericho will probably always remain contested ground between faith and skepticism. between those who see the archaeological evidence as confirming an ancient truth and those who see it as showing that the narrative is legendary or symbolic rather than historical. Perhaps the most we can say is that the story is set in a real place that really did experience violent destruction at some point in the Bronze Age. Whether that destruction was caused by Israelite conquest, by other military campaigns, by earthquake, or by some combination of factors, remains open to interpretation. The debate over dating. In archaeology, chronology is everything. Knowing when something happened allows us to understand its context, its causes, its effects. But establishing accurate dates for events 3,000 years ago is remarkably difficult, and the debates over the dating of Jericho's destructions illustrate just how complex and contentious this process can be. Let's start with the basic methods archaeologists use to date ancient sites. The most straightforward is stratigraphy, the principle that in undisturbed deposits, lower layers are older than upper layers. This is simple enough in theory, but can be complicated in practice. At a site like Jericho that's been occupied for millennia, later inhabitants often disturbed earlier layers. Pits, dug for storage or burials, can cut through multiple layers. Building foundations can be sunk deep into earlier deposits. Erosion can remove layers entirely. Sorting out this complex three-dimensional puzzle requires exceptional skill and careful observation. Related to stratigraphy is ceramic typology. Pottery styles changed over time in predictable ways. Shapes of vessels evolved, decorative techniques changed, types of clay and firing methods developed. Archaeologists have painstakingly documented these changes at sites across the region, creating sequences of pottery types that can be used for dating. If you find a particular type of pot at a site, you can compare it to the established sequence and say, this type was made between 1600 and 1500 BCE, so this layer must date to that period. This works reasonably well, but it has limitations. Pottery types didn't change overnight. There were transition periods when old and new styles coexisted. Some styles lasted longer in some more regions than others, and old pottery could remain in use or be mixed into later deposits. Then there are Egyptian chronologies. Egypt kept detailed records and had a relatively well-established king list, allowing dates in Egypt to be determined with reasonable accuracy, especially for the New Kingdom period, roughly 1550–1077 BCE. When Egyptian artifacts like scarabs with royal names appear at sites in the Levant, they can help date those sites based on when that particular pharaoh ruled. This is where some of the controversy over Jericho's dating arises. Kenyon found scarabs in the destruction layers, but she interpreted their chronological significance differently than later researchers like Wood did. Scarabs can be tricky because they were sometimes kept as heirlooms, meaning an earlier pharaoh's scarab might be deposited in a later layer. Determining whether a scarab dates the layer it's found in, or is an older object that survived longer, requires careful analysis of the full context. In the mid-20th century, a revolutionary new dating method emerged: radiocarbon dating. All living things absorb carbon-14, a radioactive isotope that decays at a known rate after the organism dies. By measuring how much carbon-14 remains in organic material, like charcoal, grain, or bone, scientists can calculate how long ago the organism died. This sounds perfect for archaeology, and in many ways it is. But radiocarbon dating has its own complications. The measurements require sophisticated equipment and careful sample preparation. The results come with a margin of error, often plus or minus several decades. And there's a problem called the calibration curve. It turns out that the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere hasn't been constant over time. It varies based on solar activity, volcanic eruptions, and other factors. To convert a radiocarbon measurement into a calendar date, you have to calibrate it against samples of known age, like tree rings. For the Bronze Age, the calibration curve has some flat spots where a range of radiocarbon measurements could correspond to the same calendar dates, making precise dating difficult. At Jericho, radiocarbon dates have been obtained from charred grain found in the destruction layers. Garstang obtained some early radiocarbon dates that suggested destruction around 1400 BCE. Kenyon rejected these dates, arguing they were unreliable due to contamination or other problems. More recent radiocarbon dating from the Italian-Palestinian excavations has produced dates ranging from about 1600 to 1300 BCE, depending on the sample and how you interpret the calibration. Wood seized on some of these dates, particularly those clustering around 1400 BCE, as confirmation of his reinterpretation. Critics pointed out that he was being selective, emphasizing dates that fit his theory, while downplaying or explaining away dates that didn't. This brings us to a fundamental issue in archaeological interpretation: confirmation bias. We all tend to notice and emphasize evidence that supports our existing beliefs, while dismissing or minimizing evidence that challenges them. In debates like the one over Jericho's chronology, where the evidence admits multiple interpretations, this bias can lead honest, competent scholars to very different conclusions. Kenyon came to Jericho expecting to clarify Garstang's findings, but not necessarily to confirm the biblical narrative. Her training emphasized following the evidence wherever it led, and when her careful pottery analysis suggested a date too early for Joshua, she reported that honestly, even though it contradicted widespread assumptions. She was accused by some of being biased against the Bible, but her supporters argued she was simply being a good scientist, reporting what the evidence showed. Wood came to the question from a different perspective. As a biblical archaeologist who believed in the historical reliability of Scripture, he was motivated to see if Kenyon might have gotten the dating wrong. His re-examination of her evidence led him to genuinely believe she had, and he presented what he saw as solid archaeological arguments for a later date. He was accused of being biased in favor of the Bible, allowing his beliefs to cloud his judgment, but his supporters argued he was simply doing what all archaeology does: interpreting ambiguous evidence. The truth is probably that both were influenced by their prior commitments to some degree, because that's simply how human cognition works. But that doesn't mean their work has no value. Both made genuine contributions. Kenyon's meticulous excavations and careful recording preserved information that future scholars can continue to reanalyze. Wood's challenge to her chronology forced other archaeologists to reconsider assumptions and re-examine evidence. This is how scholarship progresses, through thesis and antithesis, argument and counter-argument. The current state of play, based on the most recent excavations by Lorenzo Nigro's Italian-Palestinian team, is somewhere between Kenyon and Wood. Nigro's work suggests that the major Middle Bronze fortified city was destroyed around 1550 BCE, essentially confirming Kenyon on that point. But unlike Kenyon, Nigro has found evidence of continued occupation through the Late Bronze I period, suggesting the site wasn't completely abandoned. The big question is what happened around 1350 BCE, when Nigro dates a final Late Bronze destruction. Was there still a fortified city at this point? The evidence suggests occupation, but not the massive fortifications of the Middle Bronze Age. So if Joshua arrived around 1350 BCE or a bit later, he wouldn't have found the imposing walled city of the biblical description. Unless, of course, the biblical chronology is off. Some scholars have argued for a later date for the Exodus and conquest, putting Joshua's campaign around 1200 BCE, or even later. This could potentially bring the archaeology and biblical narrative into better alignment, but it creates problems with other biblical chronologies and with the dating of the Iron Age settlements in the highlands that are often associated with early Israel. The honest conclusion is that we don't have a consensus. The Kenyon position that the city was destroyed too early for Joshua remains influential in mainstream biblical archaeology. The Wood position that she misdated the destruction has support among more conservative scholars. The Nigro position that there were multiple destructions, with Late Bronze occupation being less substantial than Middle Bronze, represents perhaps the current archaeological mainstream. What all sides can agree on is that Jericho's chronology is complex, that the evidence admits of multiple interpretations, and that new discoveries or new analytical techniques might yet shift our understanding. The debate will likely continue as long as people care about the relationship between archaeological evidence and biblical narratives. For those trying to understand this debate from outside, the key is to recognize that honest, competent scholars can look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions. This isn't a failure of archaeology. It's a reflection of the inherently interpretive nature of the discipline and the fragmentary nature of the evidence we have to work with. Dates matter because context matters. Whether Jericho fell in 1550, 1400, or 1350 BCE affects how we understand its place in the broader history of the Late Bronze Age Levant, its relationship to Egypt and other regional powers, and yes, its possible connection to biblical narratives. But perhaps we should be comfortable with some level of uncertainty, acknowledging that the past doesn't always give up its secrets definitively, and that different interpretations can coexist while scholarship continues to refine our understanding. Physical evidence. What the ground revealed. Let's step away from debate over dating and focus on what excavators at Jericho have actually found. Physical evidence has a certain undeniable reality. We might argue about what it means or when exactly it was deposited, but the facts themselves remain. Walls of specific dimensions, built using specific techniques, preserved in the ground for archaeologists to uncover and measure and photograph. The fortification system that enclosed the Bronze Age city was extraordinary by any measure. At its base was a massive stone revetment wall, carefully constructed from large stones, rising from the plain and forming the foundation for everything above it. This wall wasn't vertical, but sloped slightly outward, adding to its stability and making it harder to undermine. On top of this stone base rose an enormous earthen rampart. This wasn't simply dirt piled up haphazardly. It was a carefully engineered structure of compacted earth, built up in layers and sloping steeply upward. Think of it as a massive, artificial hill surrounding the city. The effort required to build such a rampart is staggering. Earth had to be carried in baskets, probably by hundreds of workers, then carefully layered and compacted to create a stable, sloped surface. At the top of this rampart stood the city wall itself, built of mud bricks. Mud brick was the standard building material for walls in this region and period. Made from clay, mixed with straw and dried in the sun, mud bricks were relatively easy to produce in large quantities. The walls at Jericho weren't made from just one layer of brick. but from two walls with space between them, creating a double wall system. The outer wall, facing potential attackers, was about 6 feet thick. Behind it, separated by a gap of perhaps 12 to 15 feet, was the inner wall, which was thicker still. This double wall arrangement served multiple purposes. The gap between the walls could be filled with rubble or earth, adding strength. Houses could be built in this gap, using the city walls as structural supports, which is likely what happened in Rahab's case. And if the outer wall was breached, defenders could fall back to the inner wall, creating a second line of defense. The total height of the fortification system, from the base of the stone revetment to the top of the mud brick walls, has been estimated at around 40 to 50 feet. Imagine being an attacker approaching such defenses. You'd first have to cross open ground where defenders could shoot at you. Then you'd have to climb a steep stone revetment, all while under fire. Then you'd face the sloped earthen rampart, difficult to scale and impossible to tunnel through. Finally, you'd have to somehow get over or through mud brick walls dozens of feet high. These weren't simple defenses. They represented the cutting edge of Middle Bronze Age military engineering, designed to withstand anything attackers of that era could throw at them. Cities in the ancient Near East competed to build the most impressive fortifications, partly for practical defense, but also as demonstrations of power and prestige. Jericho's fortifications were among the most substantial in the region. Then came the destruction. The evidence for this is vivid and extensive. Excavators have found thick layers of burnt material throughout the Bronze Age city, not just scattered patches of ash, but substantial deposits, sometimes a foot or more thick, containing charred wood, burnt brick, carbonized grain, and other debris from an intense conflagration. The character of this burning suggests it wasn't accidental. House fires happen, of course, and can spread through ancient cities where structures were built close together and often shared walls. But the extent and thoroughness of the burning at Jericho suggests something more deliberate. Multiple areas of the city show evidence of burning at the same stratigraphic level, indicating it happened at roughly the same time. This is consistent with a deliberate destruction, with attackers setting fires throughout the city to ensure total devastation. The mud brick walls show particularly interesting evidence. In some areas, the bricks are reddened from intense heat, baked almost to the hardness of pottery. This indicates temperatures high enough to essentially refire the mud, turning it into ceramic. Such heat requires sustained, intense burning, more than you'd expect from structures simply catching fire accidentally. It suggests fires were set and allowed to burn unchecked for an extended period. Structural collapse is also evident throughout the excavated areas. Walls that once stood upright are found tumbled, their bricks scattered. Room fills contain collapsed roofing materials, fallen beams, and the contents of upper stories crushed beneath the debris of their own structures. This is the archaeological signature of buildings that fell violently rather than decaying gradually over time. Particularly intriguing is the state of the fortification walls themselves. In some areas, excavators found walls that had collapsed outward, down the slope of the tell. This is unusual. Normally, when walls are destroyed by human agency, they tend to fall inward into the city as defenders push back or as attackers breach them. When walls decay naturally over time, they also typically slump inward. But outward collapse can indicate earthquake damage, where seismic waves shake a structure, loose from its foundations, and topple it down the slope. Garstang reported finding extensive evidence of such outward collapse. In his view, the walls had fallen down the slope, creating ramps of brick rubble that would have allowed attackers to climb directly into the city. This seemed to match the biblical account's statement that the people went up into the city, suggesting they climbed over fallen walls rather than entering through gates. Kenyon was more cautious about this interpretation. She found that later erosion and construction had disturbed much of the wall, making it difficult to determine exactly how it had fallen originally. She also noted that some sections of wall showed different patterns of collapse. The picture wasn't as uniform as Garstang had suggested. Recent work has confirmed that the situation is indeed complex. Some wall sections did collapse outward, possibly due to earthquake. Other sections show evidence of having been pushed over or pulled down, perhaps by attackers using ropes or siege engines. Still, other sections remained partially standing, their bases intact even while the upper portions fell. This mixed pattern suggests multiple agencies of destruction, perhaps an earthquake that weakened the walls followed by human efforts to finish the demolition, or vice versa. The grain storage at Jericho has attracted particular attention. In normal circumstances, a city under siege would consume its stored grain as the siege progressed. By the time the city fell, either the grain would be gone, eaten by the defenders, or it would be taken by the victorious attackers as valuable booty. Finding substantial quantities of grain still in storage jars after a destruction is unusual and requires explanation. Our excavators at Jericho have indeed found carbonized grain in storage vessels in the destruction layers. The grain had been heated enough by the fires to carbonize it, essentially turning it to charcoal, which preserved it for archaeologists to discover millennia later. The presence of this grain suggests either that the city fell quickly before prolonged siege depleted supplies, or that the attackers chose not to take it. The biblical narrative offers an explanation for the latter. Joshua commanded that nothing from Jericho should be taken except precious metals for the temple treasury. Everything else was to be destroyed or devoted to God. If this account is historical, it would explain why grain remained in the city to be burned. Of course, there could be other explanations. Perhaps the grain was in areas that were inaccessible after the collapse. Perhaps the victors were more interested in portable wealth than in heavy, bulky grain. Perhaps the destruction occurred at harvest time, when stores were full, and there was simply too much grain to cart away. What we can say is that the grain's presence is consistent with the biblical account, even if it doesn't prove it. Combined with the evidence of rapid, thorough destruction rather than prolonged siege, it suggests a city that fell quickly and was deliberately destroyed rather than occupied by its conquerors. Then there's the question of Rahab's house. The biblical narrative is specific. She lived in a house on the city wall, and while the rest of the walls fell, her house was preserved because she had helped the Israelite spies. Is there archaeological evidence for a house on the wall that survived the destruction? This turns out to be a difficult question to answer definitively. Houses built into fortification walls were common in ancient cities. The poor, who couldn't afford property in more desirable locations, would build against the city wall, using it as one wall of their dwelling. This saved on construction materials and gave them a place to live, though it also meant living in a potentially vulnerable location if the city were attacked. Garstang reported finding a section of outer city wall that remained standing while the walls on either side had collapsed. He proposed this could have been the location of Rahab's house, and against this section of wall, he found foundations of houses, showing people had indeed lived there. The preservation of this wall section, while others fell, would seem to match the biblical account's claim that Rahab's house survived. However, establishing the precise dating of this standing section presents real challenges. Was it from the same destruction event as the collapsed sections, or from a different building phase entirely? Kenyon questioned Garstang's interpretation, suggesting the standing section might represent construction from an earlier or later period, not from the same phase as the major Bronze Age destruction he associated with Joshua. More recently, the Italian excavations have identified sections of the fortification system, where later walls were built, incorporating and standing against earlier structures. This makes it possible that what appeared to be a preserved section from one destruction was actually a composite of materials from different building periods, without clear stratigraphic evidence showing the standing section and collapsed sections belong to the same construction phase and destruction event. It's difficult to say with certainty. What we can say is that the configuration of walls at Jericho, with the double wall system creating space where houses could be built, does match the biblical description of someone living in a house on the wall. People did build dwellings in this gap between the fortifications. This is an established fact of the site's archaeology, but whether any specific preserved section can be identified as Rahab's house ventures beyond what archaeology can reasonably determine. Even if we could identify with certainty a house on the wall that survived when others were destroyed, and that's a significant if, we couldn't know who lived there without something like an inscription, and houses belonging to common people simply didn't have such identifying markers. Beyond the walls and the evidence of destruction, excavators have uncovered details of daily life in Bronze Age Jericho that help us understand what kind of place it was. The city was densely packed with buildings. Houses shared walls. Streets were narrow. Every bit of space within the protective walls was utilized. This is typical of ancient walled cities where the need for security limited how much area could be effectively defended. The houses themselves were relatively simple structures, usually consisting of a courtyard with rooms opening off it. Courtyards were the center of domestic life, where cooking, weaving, and other daily activities took place. Roofs were flat and made of wooden beams covered with packed earth, creating additional living space where families could sleep on hot nights or dry grain and fruits. Inside the houses, archaeologists have found the tools and equipment of daily life: grinding stones for processing grains into flour, clay ovens for baking bread, large storage jars for holding grain, oil, and wine, smaller vessels for serving and eating, loom weights indicating weaving was done in the home, oil lamps for light. The full material culture of a functioning Bronze Age community. What's largely absent from the destruction layers is personal valuables. Unlike some destroyed cities where archaeologists find jewelry, precious objects, and hoarded wealth, Jericho's destruction layers contain relatively little valuable material. This could suggest that wealthy residents fled before the final destruction, taking their valuables with them. Or it could indicate that the city was thoroughly looted after its fall. Or, as the biblical account suggests, it might mean that attackers were specifically ordered not to take plunder, though precious metals were removed to be dedicated to religious purposes. The tombs around Jericho have also yielded significant information. Bronze Age peoples in this region typically buried their dead in family tombs, natural caves or rock-cut chambers where multiple generations could be interred. These tombs contained grave goods, objects buried with the dead for use in the afterlife, or to honor their memory. The tomb contents tell us about beliefs, social status, trade networks, and chronology. Pottery vessels buried with the dead can be dated stylistically, helping establish chronologies for the settlement. Jewelry and weapons indicate wealth and status. Imported items show trade connections. The presence of multiple interments in single tombs reveals family structures and burial customs. Kenyon excavated hundreds of tombs in the cemeteries around Jericho. The burial customs she discovered showed continuity over long periods, with similar practices maintained across centuries. But there were also changes, new pottery types appearing, different burial positions being adopted, imported items from new sources appearing. These changes helped her establish the chronological sequence and identify periods of cultural transformation. One particularly interesting aspect of the tomb evidence is what it reveals about the end of the Bronze Age city. If a city is destroyed suddenly, with all inhabitants killed, you'd expect the cemeteries to stop being used at the same time, with no further burials in the family tombs. If the population scattered but survived, you'd expect the tombs to continue in use elsewhere, or to show signs of being reopened for later burials. The evidence at Jericho shows a decrease in tomb use corresponding to the major destruction, but not a complete cessation. Some tombs continued to receive burials for a time, suggesting some population survived or returned. This is consistent with various scenarios. Some inhabitants escaped the destruction. Others were allowed to survive. The site was reoccupied after a period of abandonment. What emerges from all this physical evidence is a picture of a prosperous Bronze Age city that met a violent end. The fortifications were substantial, among the best in the region. The destruction was thorough and included extensive burning. The walls collapsed, at least in part. Grain remained stored, suggesting rapid conquest or deliberate non-looting. Some wall sections may have remained standing while others fell. All of this is consistent with the biblical narrative, but it's also consistent with other explanations. What archaeology provides is not proof of what happened, but constraints on what could have happened. Any explanation has to account for the physical evidence, the massive fortifications, the evidence of earthquake or collapse, the burning, the stored grain, the pattern of destruction. Different scholars will construct different narratives that fit these constraints. Some will see the hand of God working through natural means, earthquake and fire, to deliver a city to Israelite conquest. Others will see a Canaanite city destroyed by other Canaanite city-states or by Egyptian campaigns. Still others will see multiple destructions conflated in later tradition into a single narrative event. The stones themselves don't tell us which interpretation is correct. They simply bear witness to what happened at the physical level: construction, occupation, destruction. The meaning we make of these events depends on the frameworks we bring to them. And perhaps that's as it should be. The past is past, gone beyond recall, except for the fragmentary traces it left behind. We do our best to read those traces honestly, to report what we find accurately, and to interpret it with both rigor and humility. Modern reassessment. Archaeological understanding is never static. New excavations uncover new evidence. New analytical techniques allow us to extract information from old evidence in new ways. New theoretical frameworks help us ask questions that previous generations didn't think to ask. The story of Jericho illustrates this ongoing process of reassessment and reinterpretation beautifully. Since Kenyon's groundbreaking work in the 1950s, Jericho has seen several new phases of investigation. The most significant recent work has been conducted by the Italian-Palestinian expedition to Tell es-Sultan, a joint project led by Lorenzo Nigro of the University of Rome, La Sapienza, and Hamdan Taha of the Palestinian Department of Antiquities and Cultural Heritage. This project began in 1997 and has continued with regular excavation seasons since then, making it one of the longest-running current excavations in the region. The team's work has focused on clarifying the chronology of the Bronze Age city, understanding the transition between the Middle and Late Bronze Ages, and employing new scientific techniques to extract maximum information from the site. One of the project's significant contributions has been the application of more refined pottery analysis. Since Kenyon's time, our understanding of Late Bronze Age pottery has improved considerably. More sites have been excavated, more sequences have been established, and scholars have refined the dating of specific types. All this allows for more precise dating than Kenyon could achieve. Nigro's team has identified pottery that Kenyon might have missed or misdated, including forms that suggest occupation during the Late Bronze I period. This doesn't mean Kenyon was careless. She was working with the knowledge available in her time, and she couldn't have anticipated how pottery chronologies would be refined in subsequent decades. But it does mean that her conclusion about the site being largely abandoned during the Late Bronze Age needs to be modified. The modern excavations have also employed techniques that weren't available to earlier archaeologists. Systematic flotation, where excavated soil is mixed with water to separate out tiny organic remains like seeds and charcoal, has recovered environmental data that helps reconstruct the ancient climate and economy. Specialized analyses of ancient DNA from plant and animal remains can tell us about agricultural practices and animal husbandry. Residue analysis of pottery can reveal what was stored or cooked in vessels. Ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical survey techniques allow archaeologists to see what's underground without excavating, helping them plan where to dig for maximum information. These techniques have been used at Jericho to map buried structures and understand the extent of different occupation phases. Radiocarbon dating has also become more sophisticated since the early attempts in Garstang's time. Modern accelerator mass spectrometry can date smaller samples with greater precision, and our understanding of the calibration curve has improved, though challenges remain for the Bronze Age period. The Italian-Palestinian team has obtained numerous radiocarbon dates from various contexts at the site. These dates, when taken together and properly calibrated, suggest a more nuanced chronology than either the Kenyon or Wood positions. They support the idea of major Middle Bronze occupation, ending around 1550 BCE, continued but reduced Late Bronze I occupation from about 1500 to 1400 BCE, and a final destruction event around 1350 BCE. If this chronology is correct, it means there was a fortified city at Jericho during the early Late Bronze Age, though probably not as massively fortified as the Middle Bronze city had been. By the time of the final destruction around 1350 BCE, the city may have been less impressive than the biblical narrative suggests, though still substantial enough to be worth destroying. This chronology doesn't perfectly align with any of the traditional dates proposed for the biblical conquest, which have usually been placed either around 1400 BCE, the early date based on certain biblical chronologies, or around 1200 BCE, the late date based on other evidence. At 1350 BCE, it falls between these, which some see as problematic and others see as potentially solving certain chronological puzzles. Beyond chronology, the modern excavations have focused on understanding the social and economic organization of Bronze Age Jericho. What kind of society built those massive fortifications? How was labor organized? What was the relationship between Jericho and other cities in the region and with Egypt? The evidence suggests Jericho was part of a network of city-states in the late Bronze Age Levant. These cities weren't independent in the modern sense. They existed within the sphere of Egyptian influence, paying tribute to the pharaoh and sometimes hosting Egyptian governors or garrisons. At the same time, they competed with each other for resources and influence, occasionally warring, occasionally allying. The famous Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Canaanite rulers and the Egyptian pharaohs Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, give us a glimpse into this world. While no letters from Jericho itself survive, we have letters from rulers of nearby cities like Jerusalem and Giza, complaining about enemies, asking for Egyptian support, accusing each other of disloyalty. It was a complex, unstable political landscape, and Jericho would have been part of this system. Understanding this context helps us appreciate the challenges of Bronze Age urban life. Cities like Jericho needed massive fortifications not just to defend against external enemies, but to project power and prestige in a competitive environment. Building and maintaining such fortifications required substantial resources, social organization, and probably coerced labor. The modern excavations have also revealed more about the end of the Bronze Age at Jericho and the transition to the Iron Age. This transition, around 1200 BCE, was a period of widespread disruption across the Eastern Mediterranean. The great Bronze Age civilizations, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, all experienced crisis. Cities were destroyed, trade networks collapsed, literacy declined in some areas. Archaeologists refer to this as the Late Bronze Age collapse, and its causes remain debated. At Jericho, the transition seems to have involved a period of reduced occupation, or even temporary abandonment, followed by resettlement in the Iron Age. The Iron Age settlement was different in character from the Bronze Age city, less urban, more village-like, at least initially. This pattern is seen at many sites in the region and has been associated by some archaeologists with the emergence of early Israelite settlement in the highlands. Whether the Iron Age inhabitants of Jericho were Israelites, Canaanites, or some mixture is difficult to determine from archaeology alone. Material culture at this period was relatively homogeneous across the region. Without written evidence, we can't definitively assign ethnic identities to archaeological remains. What we can say is that by the Iron Age Scone period, around 900 to 600 BCE, Jericho was again a functioning town, though never as large or as heavily fortified as it had been in the Bronze Age. Biblical texts mention the city being rebuilt in the time of King Ahab, and archaeology confirms occupation during this period. The city continued to be inhabited, with varying fortunes, through the Persian, Hellenistic, Roman, and Byzantine periods, each leaving their own layers in the tell. The modern reassessment of Jericho illustrates how archaeology is an ongoing process. We don't simply dig up the past and catalogue it. We engage with it, question it, reinterpret it as our methods improve and our understanding deepens. What Kenyon concluded in 1958 was the best interpretation of the evidence available to her at the time, using the methods and knowledge of that era. What Nigro concludes today is the best interpretation of both new evidence and re-examined old evidence, using current methods and knowledge. Future archaeologists will likely revise our current understanding in turn. They'll have techniques we can't yet imagine. They'll ask questions we haven't thought to ask. They'll bring new perspectives shaped by their own time and context. This is the nature of the discipline, and it's a strength, not a weakness. The willingness to revise, to admit uncertainty, to follow evidence even when it complicates our preferred narratives, is what makes archaeology a scholarly discipline, rather than simply a hunt for artifacts to confirm what we already believe. At Jericho, this ongoing process of investigation and reinterpretation continues. Each generation of archaeologists adding new layers of understanding to complement the physical layers in the tell itself. The larger questions. As we near the end of our journey through Jericho's archaeological story, it's worth stepping back from the details of pottery chronologies and wall construction to consider some broader questions. What does the case of Jericho teach us about the relationship between archaeology and biblical studies? What can archaeology tell us about ancient texts, and what are its limitations? How should we approach the intersection of faith and empirical evidence? These are not easy questions, and thoughtful people have arrived at different answers, but they're worth pondering, especially as we drift toward rest. First, there's the question of what archaeology can and cannot do. Archaeology is brilliant at revealing material culture, the physical stuff of past lives. It can tell us what people ate, what tools they used, what their houses looked like, how their cities were laid out. It can often tell us when cities were built and destroyed, what trading networks existed, what technologies were available. But archaeology has real limitations. It can't tell us what people thought or believed unless they left written records. It can't tell us about events that didn't leave physical traces. It can't always distinguish between different ethnic or social groups if they used similar material culture. And it struggles with precision, especially for dates before the invention of writing. These limitations become particularly relevant when archaeology is asked to verify or falsify ancient narratives. Take the Jericho case. Archaeology can tell us that a fortified city existed there in the Bronze Age and that it was destroyed. But can it tell us who destroyed it or why? Can it confirm or deny that the destruction was miraculous, caused by divine intervention rather than human agency alone? Obviously not. The question of divine action lies outside archaeology's scope. Archaeology works with natural, physical evidence. It can describe what happened at a material level, but can't adjudicate claims about supernatural causation. This doesn't make archaeology less valuable. It simply defines its proper domain. Even questions that seem more straightforward can be surprisingly difficult. Did the Israelites conquer Jericho? To answer this archaeologically, you'd need to find evidence of the presence of a distinct Israelite material culture at the site, clearly post-dating the destruction, and clearly different from what came before. But what if early Israelites used the same types of pottery, lived in similar houses, and employed similar technologies as their Canaanite neighbors? Then distinguishing them archaeologically becomes nearly impossible. This is actually the situation we face with early Israel. The material culture of the early Iron Age in the highlands, where the Bible says Israelites settled, is not dramatically different from late Bronze Canaanite culture. There are some distinctive features, certain types of house plans and collar-rimmed storage jars, but these are subtle markers, and their ethnic significance is debated. If we didn't have the biblical text telling us that Israelites were a distinct people, we might not recognize them in the archaeological record at all. This raises a fundamental question. What's the relationship between archaeological evidence and textual evidence? Should we trust texts only when archaeology confirms them? Should we trust archaeology only when it doesn't contradict text? Should we see them as independent sources that ideally should converge but might not? Different scholars take different approaches. Some biblical archaeologists treat the biblical text as a generally reliable historical source and interpret archaeological evidence in ways that harmonize with it where possible. Others treat the text as primarily theological literature that may contain historical memories but shouldn't be read as straightforward history. Still others try to bracket the biblical text entirely when doing archaeology, treating it as just another source to be evaluated rather than the framework for interpretation. Each approach has strengths and weaknesses. Treating the Bible as reliable history can lead to confirmation bias, where ambiguous evidence is always interpreted in ways that support the text. But treating it as purely legendary can lead to dismissing real historical memories simply because they're embedded in theological narratives. The most balanced approach is probably to recognize that ancient texts and archaeological evidence are different types of sources with different strengths and weaknesses, and that we need both to understand the past fully. Texts can tell us about events, motivations, and beliefs in ways that archaeology cannot. Archaeology can provide objective verification and can reveal aspects of daily life that texts ignore. When they agree, we can be more confident in our understanding. When they disagree, we have a puzzle to solve, which might mean revising our interpretation of the text or our interpretation of the archaeology, or both. At Jericho, the text and the archaeology provide an interesting case study. The biblical narrative is specific and dramatic. A fortified city conquered through miraculous intervention after a week-long ritual. The archaeology reveals a fortified city or cities destroyed violently in the Bronze Age, with evidence of burning and collapse. There's overlap here, enough to suggest the narrative isn't purely invented. But there's also mismatch, particularly on timing, with the archaeological evidence not quite lining up with when the biblical event supposedly occurred. How do we make sense of this? One possibility is that the biblical narrative preserves a genuine historical memory of a conquest of Jericho, but the details have been shaped by centuries of oral tradition and theological reflection. The walls may have fallen, but perhaps to earthquake or military siege rather than trumpet blasts. The destruction may have occurred, but perhaps decades or even centuries removed from when the biblical chronology places it. The narrative may conflate multiple events, or it may dramatize a more mundane conquest. Another possibility is that the narrative is more literary than historical, a story told to make theological points rather than to record what actually happened. In this reading, Jericho becomes a symbolic first victory in the Promised Land, representing God's power to deliver on His promises. Whether the historical details are accurate becomes less important than the theological message. A third possibility, of course, is that the biblical account is essentially accurate, and archaeological difficulties stem from our incomplete evidence or incorrect interpretations. Maybe the destruction was in 1400 BCE, as Wood argues, or maybe it was later, and our conventional chronologies are wrong. Maybe the late Bronze occupation was more substantial than current evidence suggests. Maybe future excavations will resolve the apparent discrepancies. Which of these possibilities we find most plausible probably depends less on the evidence itself than on our prior commitments. Those who come to the question with strong faith commitments will tend toward the third possibility. Those who come with skepticism about supernatural claims will tend toward the first or second. Those trying to remain neutral will probably acknowledge that any of the three could be true and admit we don't have enough evidence to decide definitively. And perhaps that's okay. Perhaps we don't need absolute certainty about exactly what happened at Jericho 3,000 years ago. Perhaps we can appreciate the biblical narrative for its theological and literary power, while also appreciating what archaeology reveals about Bronze Age urban life. Perhaps we can hold multiple interpretations loosely, acknowledging both the genuine historical memories that likely underlie the text and the reality that those memories have been shaped and refined by tradition. What Jericho's archaeological story ultimately teaches us is humility. Humility about the limits of our knowledge. Humility about the difficulty of recovering past events from fragmentary evidence. Humility about the role our own assumptions and commitments play in how we interpret that evidence. The scholars who've worked at Jericho have been remarkably dedicated, clever people who devoted years of their lives to understanding this one site. They've employed increasingly sophisticated methods, generated mountains of data, published detailed reports, and yet they still disagree about fundamental questions like when the city was destroyed and whether those destructions relate to biblical narratives. This disagreement isn't a failure of archaeology or of scholarship. It's a recognition of the inherent difficulty of the task and the complex, multifaceted nature of truth about the past. The past really happened. Real people built those walls, lived in that city, experienced its destruction. But accessing that reality from 3 millennia away, with only fragmentary physical remains and ancient texts to guide us, is extraordinarily challenging. Perhaps the most important lesson is that both faith and scholarship require humility. Faithful readers of Scripture should acknowledge that archaeological evidence sometimes raises difficult questions about historical details, and that's okay because faith isn't ultimately about getting every historical detail right. Archaeologists should acknowledge that absence of evidence for biblical claims isn't necessarily evidence of absence, and that texts can preserve genuine historical memories, even when those memories have been shaped by theological concerns. The conversation between archaeology and biblical studies is ongoing and valuable precisely because it's difficult. Easy answers would be less interesting and probably less true to the complexity of reality. The fact that we have to wrestle with the evidence, that we have to hold uncertainty, that we have to reconsider our conclusions, keeps us honest and keeps us learning. Conclusion. Silent stones, enduring questions. As we come to the end of our exploration of Jericho's archaeological story, let's allow our minds to settle, to rest with the images and ideas we've encountered. Picture that ancient tell rising from the desert, layer upon layer of human history, preserved in earth and stone. Picture the archaeologist, past and present, carefully excavating, meticulously recording, trying to coax stories from silent remains. The stones of Jericho really are silent now. The people who built them, who lived within their protection, who died when they fell, those people are gone beyond recall. Their voices are stilled, their stories forgotten, except for the fragmentary traces they left in the ground and the memories that were preserved, transformed in ancient texts. And yet those stones speak, don't they? Not in words, but in their mere presence, their placement, their state of preservation. A wall speaks of the effort required to build it, the fear that motivated its construction, the community organization that made it possible. Collapsed bricks speak of sudden disaster, of a city's violent end. Stored grain speaks of abundance interrupted, of lives cut short before granaries could be emptied. Layers of ash speak of fire and destruction, of an intensity of burning that suggests more than accident. These physical facts are real and undeniable, even when their interpretation remains uncertain. And that's one of the beauties of archaeology. Unlike literary or historical analysis, which works entirely with words and their meanings, archaeology gives us tangible connections to the past. We can touch the same bricks that ancient builders touched. We can stand in the same spaces where ancient people lived. We can hold in our hands the same vessels from which they ate and drank. This physicality grounds us, connects us across the millennia to our shared humanity. The people of Bronze Age Jericho were different from us in many ways. They lived shorter lives, knew less about the world, lacked technologies we take for granted, but they also loved their children, feared their enemies, worked hard to build security and prosperity, and hoped for better futures. They were human, fully and completely, just as we are. The archaeological investigation of Jericho has given us unprecedented access to their world. We know more about Bronze Age Jericho than any previous generation could have imagined. We can reconstruct their diet, their architecture, their trade networks, their burial customs, even something of their chronology and the disasters they faced. But we also know the limits of our knowledge. We don't know for certain exactly when the major destructions occurred. We don't know who caused them or why. We don't know how to correlate them definitively with textual accounts. We don't know the names of anyone who lived there, except for Rahab, and we can't confirm whether she was a real person or a character in a story. This mixture of knowledge and ignorance, of confidence and uncertainty, characterizes archaeological work generally, but is particularly acute at sites like Jericho, where archaeology intersects with cherished religious texts. The stakes feel higher somehow. People care deeply about whether the Bible is historically accurate. Archaeological findings at Jericho are therefore not just academic curiosities, but touch on questions of faith, identity, and truth. This makes the work both more meaningful and more fraught. More meaningful because it connects to something people genuinely care about, addresses questions that matter beyond the ivory tower. More fraught because it's harder to remain objective when the findings either confirm or challenge beliefs we hold dear. The archaeologists who've worked at Jericho have generally tried to maintain scholarly integrity while acknowledging their own commitments and biases. Kenyon was honest about what her evidence showed, even when it complicated the biblical narrative. Wood was honest about his faith commitments while arguing for his interpretation. Nigro has tried to chart a middle course, following the evidence carefully while remaining open to multiple interpretations. All of them, we might say, have served the silent stones well, giving them voices again after millennia of muteness, translating their mute testimony into words we can understand. That translation is imperfect, always provisional, but it's genuine service to both the past and the present. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you might carry with you an image of those stones. Not as proof of anything in particular, not as weapons in debates about faith and history, but simply as witnesses. They witnessed the building of the first settlements in the Neolithic. They witnessed the flowering of Bronze Age civilization. They witnessed destructions and rebuildings, prosperity and disaster, the rise and fall of peoples and cultures. They're still there, patiently waiting in the ground at es-Sultan. some exposed to the air by archaeologists' careful work, others still buried, their stories not yet told. Future generations will come with new questions, new methods, new perspectives. They'll excavate further, analyze more deeply, perhaps revise current conclusions. And that's as it should be. The conversation with the past is never finished. Each generation has to engage anew, bringing fresh eyes to old evidence, asking questions shaped by contemporary concerns, using whatever tools and techniques are available. The past doesn't change, but our understanding of it evolves, hopefully, toward greater clarity and truth. Perhaps the most important thing we can learn from Jericho's archaeological story is simply this: the past is both accessible and mysterious, both knowable and elusive. We can learn about it, can uncover real facts, can reconstruct significant parts of how people lived and what happened to them, but we can never know it completely, can never achieve total certainty about events from 3,000 years ago. This should make us humble about our claims. Whether we're arguing that archaeology proves the Bible or that it disproves it, we're probably claiming more certainty than the evidence actually allows. The evidence is rich but ambiguous, detailed but fragmentary, revealing but also concealing. Living with this ambiguity, accepting that some questions may never be definitively answered, is part of mature engagement with both history and faith. We can have convictions without having certainty. We can pursue truth while acknowledging its elusiveness. We can honor both the stones and the stories, the physical evidence and the textual traditions, the archaeologists and the faithful, recognizing that each offers a partial but valuable glimpse into the complex reality of the past. The walls of Jericho have fallen, that much is certain, whether they fell to Joshua's trumpets or to earthquake or to military siege, whether they fell in 1550 or 1400 or 1350 BCE, whether the biblical narrative is history or theology or some mixture of both. These questions will probably continue to be debated, and that's okay. The debate itself is valuable, keeping us engaged with both text and evidence, preventing either from becoming dead letter or inert fact. What matters most is that we approach these questions with integrity, with genuine curiosity, with respect for both the evidence and the people on all sides of the debate, with humility about the limits of our knowledge, and with openness to revision as new evidence or new perspectives emerge. The silent stones of Jericho have much to teach us if we know how to listen. They teach us about human ingenuity in building those massive fortifications, about human vulnerability in the face of disaster, about the rise and fall of civilizations, about the long arc of human history and our small place in it, about the challenges of knowing the past and the value of trying anyway. As your breathing slows and sleep approaches, let these thoughts settle gently. Let the images of ancient walls, patient archaeologists, passionate debates, and enduring mysteries fade into peaceful rest. The stones will still be there tomorrow, still silent, still waiting, still ready to teach us what they can about the deep human past and our connection to it. Sleep well, knowing that the search for truth continues, that each generation adds its understanding to the accumulated wisdom of those who came before, and that the past, while never fully recoverable, is never completely lost either. It lives on in the ground beneath our feet, in the texts we preserve, in the questions we ask, and in the wonder we feel when we touch something 3,000 years old and feel, across that vast gulf of time, our connection to people who were, in the end, not so different from ourselves. Sweet dreams. May they be filled with ancient cities and fallen walls, with mystery and discovery, with questions and provisional answers, and with the deep satisfaction that comes from engaging seriously with the past and the enduring human questions it poses to each new generation. Thanks for listening to Scripture and Slumber. If you enjoyed this journey through time to ancient Jericho, please consider subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell icon to be notified when new videos are released. Your likes, comments, and shares help others discover these explorations of biblical archaeology and ancient history. Sleep well, and until next time, may your dreams be filled with wonder at the long human story of which we're all a part.